Hey, welcome back to Worthy Mother podcast. Today we are tackling a topic that is kind of hard to talk about. I think there might be some big emotions coming through in this episode. We're going to be talking about grief and motherhood, specifically around the holidays. So, a lot of people out there are facing grief in different forms from whatever it might be in their life that could bring up grief. And that experience of grief can be amplified during the holidays. There's a lot happening where we're spending time with family, we're spending time with loved ones, and can just bring up a lot of feelings of the way things used to be or the way things should be or whatever it is, right? And so I think this is a really important conversation to have. For me, I am going through a divorce right now. This is going to be the first holiday season where we're navigating what that looks like as a family. And I know that grief is going to be a part of that experience for me. So I'm really grateful that I get to have this conversation and hope that it helps anyone out there listening who might be dealing with grief in whatever form that is happening in your life.
Welcome to Worthy Mother podcast. I'm your host, Emily Hardy, a mom of two on a mission to help moms everywhere feel less alone. This is not a parenting podcast. Instead, it's a space for pushing back against societal expectations of perfection and embracing self-compassion in your motherhood journey. Let's get into it.
For this conversation today, I have Gabriela Blanco of Healing Parents joining me. She is going to be just a wealth of knowledge and experience for us today in this conversation. Again, I'm so grateful that you are here, Gabriela. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know about the work you do.
Thank you, Emily. It's really good to be with you. I'm so happy that I found you. As soon as I found your work in your podcast, it was like, oh, yes, this is what moms need. Like this is the vision and this is the support. So I'm thrilled to be with you and be on this podcast. I don't know if this happens to you, but I always find that like the older I get, that question of like talk about yourself, it's like, okay, who are you? So I'm just going to go with kind of what feels right for us and the group of people that are probably listening to us today. So, of course, I'm going to start with being a mother. I am a mother to an amazing 8-year-old who is just, I delight in her in so many ways. But one of the things that really stands out to me often about her is that she keeps me like on my existential toes with her questions and her kind of all the things she's wondering and conclusions she's having about stuff. I'm also an ex-partner to her dad. We've been co-parenting her since she was about 2. So we've been separated ever since. And I am also the daughter of immigrants from Mexico who grew up in Southern California. I grew up in a very white, wealthy, conservative part of Southern California. And I was the daughter of a gardener and a house cleaner. My parents had very stereotypical Mexican immigrant jobs. So that added a lot of depth and challenges and beautiful things as well to that particular upbringing. And I'm also a recovering like savior of the world. As far as I can remember, president of the community service club in high school, those kinds of things from early on. But then I went and I did the Peace Corps for 2 years in South America. I moved here to Oaxaca 20 years ago to work in a nonprofit organization working with childhood malnutrition. And I have, in all of these things, experienced so much grief. And a lot of times it's the grief of the meaning that I had attached to things or the grief of the many hopes that have come along. The grief of just like the reality of what it all is and what my life is and what I might be hoping at any given point that it could be. And now I'm a lot of things, small business owner. I started Healing Parents several years ago. And, one of the things that I think is so important about supporting parents, however you're doing this work, is for parents, especially mothers, to understand that learning really good parenting skills or tools is not at odds with caring for yourself. And unfortunately, it can seem that way when there's this real expert lens put on how to do parenting. You can feel like you're being talked down to, and you can even feel like you're being told to get mindful, mama. because your kids need it, right? And it's like, well, what if it's just all the same thing? What if it shouldn't be expected of us to figure out this parenting thing without some really good, solid tools to help us get through it? And what if that is a part of the doing this well and feeling connected to our sense of worth puzzle, but it's not the only one, right? I'm not worthy as a mother just because I've got some great tools and I practice them and I've gotten good at them, but it is a really important part of us being able to do this with that confidence and that support. And then another thing that we do at Healing Parents is, so in addition to that real education around child development and how to support children, it's leaning really, really hard into mutual support, really hard into mutual listening, and also that acceptance that we all need ongoing community and guidance. And so there's as much of an educational piece in Healing Parents as there is an ongoing community piece.
It's so beautiful to hear you speak about that and just how this work to support mothers and to support mothers in raising the next generation is so complex in the way that it is not just answering the like, how do we parent better
Yeah.
or whatever it is, right? But how also in that complexity, there is the opportunity to say, you know what, if I focus on my own healing, if I focus on my own development as a human, that actually is kind of the answer to it all.
Yeah.
And that is a really beautiful opportunity that we get as mothers to tap into ourselves and to feel like I can prioritize my own energy into my own growth because it not only benefits me, it benefits my children and it benefits those around me and the world, right? And so it
Yeah. Yeah.
really is, it comes up a lot here, but it really cannot be understated just the value of pouring into yourself and providing that space for your own healing.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
So there were some things you said in there about your own grief through your lifetime that really struck me as powerful because I think sometimes when we think about grief, we have these kind of, I don't know if sterile is the right word, but like these ideas of what grief is, like this
Yeah.
idea that grief is, when someone dies, you grieve them or whatever, right? And yes, that is grief and it can happen in stages and all this. But grief is so much more than that. And grief can come from so many different experiences or the lack of experiences or reflection on hopes, like you
Totally.
said.
Yeah.
It's so massive. So I would love to just hear from you, like how you define grief. What is it? What qualifies as grief? What types of grief might moms be dealing with?
Yeah. So I like just this real simple idea that it's what we do when we've experienced loss.
Mhm.
And it can look like from the moment we kind of feel that disappointment, like, ah, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And I didn't even know what I thought it was going to be until this happened. And I realized it's not. It's not what I was hoping for or thinking. So a lot of times it's that first feeling we have when the event just kind of surprises us. And yes, sometimes that event really can be, the phone call I got not even a year ago when my sister was like, Dad's in the hospital. And it's like, dad doesn't go to the hospital. It's that moment is when the grief can start and you don't even really know what it's going to be. But no, wait, no, And I think as mothers, sometimes we don't realize the many things that we're grieving at the same time. And I know that this can sound like, oh, maybe that's not really grief, but I do think that the way we relate to our disappointments has a lot to do with our ability to grieve well. So it really can be like, I was hoping that this family vacation would be something where I have a vacation. I was hoping to feel like a team with my partner. I was hoping that my kids would love this thing I planned for them. And sometimes that can even feel like I was kind of hoping for a different life, like a different experience overall. This isn't what I thought it would be. And that in itself, like those moments when we understand grief and we let the practice of grieving well into our lives, then we start to see all these different unique ways that we're grieving. And we're saying, oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And now what? And ouch. And I want the ouch to go away. And then, so what can I do to pretend this isn't happening? And that actually is a really good segue, I think, into the 5 stages of grief, which a lot of people, I think, have unnecessarily wanted to like debunk. And I really, when I hear that, it's usually like, I think a not understanding of how that was presented. And I'm actually going to hold up this book called On Grief and Grieving by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, because this is where they talk about the 5 stages of grief, but also it comes from her previous work on the 5 stages of death. And the first thing you read when you read that book is, this has been so misunderstood. This is not a linear process that you're ever done with. This is not like tying it up in a cute little bow, right? This is not an escape from real grief if you learn just the way it's supposed to work. And it's not all encompassing, right? It's not everything there is to it. It's a way of just helping us to make sense of what we're experiencing and realize that everyone is going through this in some way or another. And it kind of comes to like smack you in the face when you lose someone in a big, big way like death. So I will mention those as a kind of wrap up to my definition of grief. And it's funny because I know them, and then every time I'm going to do an interview on something, I'm like, I'm going to forget them in a minute. So I'm going to look at the book. So it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so I can tell you right now that I, on a regular basis, watch my daughter move through all of these about something that isn't going the way she wants in life. And she doesn't move through them in that sequential order every time, but I see her doing the dance with all of these. And it's like a lot of times we're dancing with the acceptance. Like, okay, I remember when I started using the language of like, oh, my dead dad, I just really had to, there was this new level of acceptance that in no way was competing with the deep sadness and the moments of trying to go back and bargain and see, like, what if I had done this differently? And like, it was all a part of it. And nothing was indicating that I had done a better or worse job, or I was in a better or worse place with it. Just, this is it. This is, once you join this club, you're in. And okay, what does that mean? What does that feel like to, join each other in this?
Yeah. I mean, I will say that for me, in my situation that I'm going through right now,
Mhm.
the roller coaster ride of emotions and of acceptance, and of then having those days where I'm like, shot right back into some other part of grief where it's like a lot harder. And I'm like, oh my goodness, am I backsliding? And, those feelings that come up of almost like shame around the different things that you might be grieving. And if it's like the hope for some future that never even existed and you never were really clear on what that was in the first place, there can be a lot of like shame of like, was I naive to even
Yeah.
think that was a possibility? But
Mhm.
I think having the lens of this, it's stages that you go through, and those stages may not be linear. They may be connected to different pieces of things that you're grieving, right? It's not just one thing that you're grieving. It's not just a loss that you're grieving. It's also the missed future things that you may be grieving, and how complex and intertwined that all may be. Having that view of it can be really helpful in accepting whatever stage you're at, and knowing that it's not like necessarily a reflection of like, oh, you've backslid and you're back at square one or something. It's like, no, this is just how it works. We're always processing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like that ongoing in and out. And I like it, this idea that it's like that spiral that you just come, you come back to everything again, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe just the space in between things or the intensity of the stages and like the way in which they make sense or not starts to change. It might start to become more a part of you. That image that they always do of the like, there's like a little circle and it's grief, and then there's a circle around it, and it's just barely fitting around it. And they're like, okay, what happens over time isn't that your grief gets smaller. Your grief is there, but you grow around it, and you have more room then to give it its place. And to me, that's really beautiful. And that really does reflect how I've experienced it, where just because I now bring more perspective, it doesn't make it go away, right? Just because there are things that are now, that was what needed to happen. It's better this way. And you can see all the reasons why, and you're even starting to enjoy the reasons why. And the grief is still there. And the sadness and the loss and the part of you that wishes that never had to change can always be there.
It represents what it is to be human, I think, in a very real way. And
Yeah.
it's such a strange thing to recognize, like, this is the human experience. This is part of it. Feeling big feelings about big things. Like, it's
Yeah.
unavoidable.
And sometimes about little things, big, big feelings about little, little things.
Yeah. Things
Yeah.
that feel really big, even if it's, yeah, it's something that you have accepted and you're even happy about. There can be those big, big feelings about just all the aspects of it.
Yeah.
Something like, obviously we're going into the holiday season, and something that's really on my mind is how I know that there are going to be things throughout the holidays that are going to hit me differently, and I can't necessarily prepare for what that's going to look like. But there's a lot of tradition and expectation of just being with family and being with the people we love, and the things that we've done in the past and what we hoped for the future that come up during this time of year. And so I'm hoping you can kind of share with us, in your experience and in the experience of parents that you work with, what can kind of happen during this time of year when it comes to grief.
Yeah, well, let me just say that the holidays, like the traditional American holidays, have always brought up so much for parents, at least the parents I listen to and I work with, whether they're separated or not. I don't know how many examples I've heard of people just like wanting to be really excited and their partner doesn't want to be, and how painful that can be. There's all of these little things that don't feel little, right? And you just kind of normalize them, and they're the day to day. But the idea of the holidays, I think for so many people can bring so much longing, even from our childhoods. I know that in particular, that was like one of the only times of the year that I felt truly like joyful and hopeful and thought everything was going to be okay. I like grasped onto the holiday cheer as a kid. And the ways that we kind of sometimes let go of that and accept what it was really like, or, that can be painful. And then there's so much pressure in modern society to do everything perfectly. And then, all the gift giving and all of these things that even if you decide that that really isn't in your value system and you don't want to totally give in to that, it's everywhere. And so sometimes you're still trying to let go of the pressure, but you still feel it, to do all of these things a certain way. Or you're still kind of grieving the illusion that you're the kind of person who goes to everything and does everything great, because you're like, wait, that isn't me. Why have I been pretending that's me? But it still hurts. And it's still hard to kind of step into a different way of responding to those activities or those invitations. And so, those are just kind of the general ones. But then when this is your first holiday without the family unit that you were used to, oh my man, like I still have this memory, and so does my daughter, of like pushing through that first Christmas when her dad and I had separated, and setting it up in a way that was going to be really nice for her, because we were going to do Christmas Day together, but the Christmas Eve was going to be at my house. And, we had to like spread it all out. And I remember at some point, I was like getting through it all. And I don't remember, had we already done the thing with her dad yet the next day? I don't remember even 24th, 25th, but I just sat on this gray chair that I have and just sobbed. And she came out of her room and was like, Mommy, you're sad. And I was like, yeah. Yeah, sometimes when you hold in the sadness a lot, it just needs to come out. And I feel better. And that was my grief, because that holiday for her was great. Right? And her experience of the grief around our separation didn't start to really happen until she was about 5, 6. And that part really surprised me, you know? So it's like every year gives us, and things like holidays, things like birthdays, things like, you know, these dates that are meant to be a family affair and we're all together. They're just going to show us where it's hurting for us, where we've grown in our capacity to hold it, but then maybe one particular kiddo is going to, that's the year they need some more support, and another is feeling good. You know, it's just this, these reminders that are going to set things off in us. And that's where I think that beyond preparing for the holidays, which I know this will help everybody to do, it's like, do you know how to grieve well? Is there a culture in your family that really makes room for grieving well? Because I have come to believe that it's not about the way your family unit is set up. You know, there's all these factors that people worry about. Did you space out your kids enough, or did you do it too much? Or the many, many questions that people stress out about. Those can matter to you, and that's okay. But what's going to matter the most in the kind of emotional integrity and that support you can have for each other as a family is, can we move through this thing in a way that brings us closer together? Can we move through this thing in a way that acknowledges, you know, who we are? Do we have appropriate places to take the different things that come up for us around these losses and these changes? That's going to be the big one. And then we're going to really need to lean into that around the holidays or around whatever is particularly meaningful in your life and in your kids' lives.
I want to get into that a little bit. What does that look like to grieve well? How do we set that up for ourselves? Because you're saying all this, and like, okay, yes,
Yeah.
I can see how relevant in my own life all of this is and is going to continue to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does that look like to set myself up for grief and to do it in a way that's the most productive, I guess? Like, you know, to get through it in a way that does allow for that opportunity for healing and does allow for the opportunity for me to like actually experience the emotions, but then also for my children to be able to have that space as well as they inevitably feel grief in this experience and in other experiences in their life.
Yeah. It's funny because I trained with hand-in-hand parenting, and you know they have these 5 parenting tools, and I remember at some point I was like, wait a minute, these are grief tools. And that is not going to be like a sexy sell, right? Like, oh, I teach you grief tools. And they're not only grief tools, but like, wow, these really set our kids up to grieve. So I'm going to start with that, with like really supporting their capacity to grieve well, and then how that relates to ours. So, you know, we all come into this world with so many just natural mechanisms to heal, right? To experience the loss. Like, here I am, closer than I will ever be to my mother inside her womb. Why would I ever want this to end? Like, this is it. And so, no, if there were a way to ask that baby, like, want to be farther away from her, and then now she can like put you down, and then, you know, you're not always feeling that. Like, no, no, please, no, I'm not down with that. That's my guess of what it would be like for the baby, right? And so then what happens? You come out into the world and you're like, I'm separate. And then you realize that you're not. And so you can cry and you can express the fear, the discomfort, the panic of what that might be. And if you have those eyes looking back at you and you have someone holding you through it, there's this association between the loss and the fear, but the safety as well. And so you move through that grief, you move through the, wait, no, it does put me back, you know, and then there's something different there. And then there's the nursing, if that's a part of your experience, and the holding and the hearing the voices in a different way, and the eye contact. And those things don't make the other one go away, but they can hold it. Right. And I feel like it's one thing after another where if we know how to support them well, they know what to do. They know how to kick and scream and deny and say, no, I refuse. I don't want it to be this way. They know how to say, this is one I heard recently, maybe if I hadn't agreed to try this new school, then I wouldn't be feeling this way. And maybe if this and maybe if that. And, they don't need anything from us to grieve well. Like, we don't need to teach them to grieve well. We don't need to say it's time to connect with your sadness and have a good cry. They don't even need us to say it's okay to feel all those things. What they really need us to do is to know how to show up more than anything with our bodies, with our eye contact, with our capacity to hold and embrace as they work their way through stuff. And so one of these things has to do with how do we hold space for their difficult emotions. And so I really prefer to see the idea of holding space through this lens, as opposed to like, here's a method for tantrums and meltdowns, or here's and it's like, here is how we teach them that it is good to lean in to holding and care when you feel bad, that it is good to express it and feel it when you just don't want that thing to not have happened or to happen, right? It is okay. And the way we show them that is by what do we do when they express their grief, right? So even starting from the time that they're babies. Okay, I'm not going to allow you to be suffering with a diaper that feels awful or something that's hurting you. We're going to make sure you've got what you need, but sometimes they just need to have the cry, and we don't need to shake the rattle in their face and, I will just hold you close and look in your eyes and be with you as you get through this. And if we provide enough experiences like that for our children enough of the times, not every single time, but if they come to understand that that is an important like thread in the fiber of the relationship, then they don't have a lot of the messed up stuff that we bring to grief, where we're like, I'm okay, or I'm going to focus on the positive, or, where we think we have to do all these things instead of just feel it and understand that fear a lot of times that we have of how awful it will be if we let ourselves go there has to do a lot with the support we didn't get in our own grief in our childhoods. Because I can tell you, like, my kid's a master of grief. Like, she's like, I need to go for it. Even at my dad's funeral, just watching her being able to stand over a coffin and wail and sob and say his name over and over again. We all wanted to be doing that, right? And she was just doing it. She was doing that thing that we were all feeling. And, so that's a really big part of it. And that means that we have to be okay with the fact that their lives hurt. And we have to be okay with the fact that a lot of things about their lives that hurt are because of our decisions, right? So in the moment that they're saying, I don't want to have two houses, I don't want to miss you when I'm at daddy's, and I don't want to miss him when I'm with you, I just want to always be with the two of you. And you say, yeah, I get that. And you don't try to say, yeah, but aren't you so lucky you have two houses now? Or isn't this great though? I mean, we were just so unhappy though. Now we're both better for you. All of those things can also be true in another moment. But right now, they need us to meet them where they're at and say, yeah. And that then can set off the grief in us. Mm-hmm. And where are we going to take our grief? That can sometimes sound like, I have just broken her heart. I have just let her down. I have just done this. I am just doing that. But it also might sound like, can they just stop already with the fucking complaining? Sorry for the language. About, like, we have worked so hard to make this like a good and like they just don't like, grief is not just the soft and the I mean, the rage that I felt towards nurses in my dad's hospital, I needed to take that somewhere. people at, like we need to really have that safe space. So having a truly safe and good container established in your life for your grief for the rest of your life is a non-negotiable element of grieving well. And if you have to grieve the fact that that does not exist in the form of your mom and sisters or partner and buddies or whatever, and you realize, no, when it comes to this thing, when it comes to certain pieces of this, I don't really have anyone in my life who isn't trying to take my mind off of it or pretend it didn't happen. You need that. And sometimes that in itself then will bring up a lot of grief. But when you have it, that becomes this game changer, this before and after to be able to have that space.
Starting that off, talking about how our children grieve and how we as children grieved until it was maybe told to us that that wasn't societally acceptable to break down and cry in, whenever you feel grief, basically, right? I think that's for many of us, that's how it happens, right? We start as babies acting a certain way and then are taught that that's not how you act.
Mm-hmm.
I think recognizing it in that way, when you were saying all of that about how children react, it does give kind of this feeling of hope of like that's in there, right? Like I have access to that. It might just be hard to access because I've been trained out of it. And for different people, that's going to be at different levels. For me, I am a crier, and crying is pretty easy for me, and I will do it in front of anybody. And like, sorry if it makes you uncomfortable. For a lot of people, that's not the case, right? For a lot of people, that's like there's so many walls up for that. And so understanding that there may be differences in how we have to create that space. Like you said, you may not have the space to let it out in the way that you need to let it out. And there can be grief in that as well, not having that. But I think it still just gives the hope that like it's the possibility to be able to move through that grief is there because that's how we're designed. We're designed to be able to feel those big feelings and all the big feelings, the sadness, the anger, the denial, the like all of it. It's all part of it, and we all can do that.
Exactly. Yeah. And, maybe another way of understanding it too is we're not always needing to necessarily move through it, but do we have a space where we can be with it? And exactly what you said, like it's easy for you to cry, and having a space where someone can come and whatever it is for them at that moment is it. And that is being with your grief. And there's no agenda to, just like with our kids, they can sniff out an agenda when you're trying to get them through the aggression so that they'll get to the tears of healing. Or no, just like, oh, your way of grieving well right now is blaming me for everything that is wrong in this day that I've worked so hard to make work well. Whoa, okay, that's grief. That's what she needs to do, right? And then my simultaneous grief, which is being experienced maybe in the form of just utter, like feeling sorry for myself and misunderstood and unfairly blamed, and knowing, wow, I can't take that here. Oh my God, like where will I be able to take that? And that's that container, that space, that's valid. That's it. It doesn't need to be like, let's process, let's, get to, it's like, whatever you got, I'm here for it. We need that person in our lives, and we get to be that person for our kids.
Yeah. So something that came up when you're talking about grief and experiencing grief and sometimes seeing our kids experience grief and knowing that the thing that they may be experiencing grief over we may have a hand in that. Guilt and shame is coming back up again for
Oh,
me.
yeah.
And it's like it's in so many, it's that, and then it's in like the naivety of like the why am I grieving something that never existed? And it's in I made a decision. I don't really have a right to feel XYZ, all these things, right? I don't even know what my question is, but like maybe you can speak to the guilt and shame that comes up and how we can maybe reposition ourselves with that if that is coming up.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there is this quote from Marie Howe that I love just sharing. It's really simple, but she's telling this story It's on her podcast interview with Krista Tippett, actually, not being. So it's a poet, Marie Howe. She's talking about her brother's death. Her brother died very young of AIDS, and it was obviously a huge loss, and how she knew in that moment that she could either kind of let it break her heart open or seal it shut. And she said, the good thing about open is that you join everybody. You realize there's all these people waiting for you who have lost and who are saying, here we are. And right after she shares that, she's like, and, similarly, I remember being with my 6-year-old daughter in Austin, Texas, and we were making a bed. And she said to me, why do I have to do this? And I said, because I said so. And that was probably the first and last time that I said that to my daughter. But in that moment, I joined the club. And there were all these parents who had done that before. And they're like, yep, we've said it too. Come on in. Right. And I love remembering that when I'm messing up left and right as a mom, of just like, yeah, if any part of me was holding on to the idea that I could somehow do this better, or that I could somehow, um, defeat my humanity and be superhuman. Like, I'm going to just let that part grieve. And I'm just going to go ahead and say, okay, here we are. Here we all are. And that is immediately just, you can like turn towards your children and be like, yeah, here we all are. Disappointed, hurting, like this is it. And we're together. Being able to name that and being able to just be like, I feel like a total shit, mom. Like, why? I have definitely, that safe container. I have many of these now that I have intentionally built into my life. Parentheses, most of these people are not friends and they're not professionals. They're just other parents like me who we take turns listening to each other on a regular basis. And to that space, I will take things like, I'm so sad about the mother that she got. I am so disappointed that this is it. And at the very same time, in that very same container, I will also bring sometimes like, she got so lucky, this kid. And so it's like, there's room for all of it. And there are moments to really lean into all of it in the right spaces where we're letting it just be. And I feel like it's almost like you pull it out of you because it's in there, and you hold it in front of you and you're like, okay, there you are. Like there's this feeling of worthlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the only one in the world-ness. And just, I don't know how ready I even am to accept that I've let my kid down. And there's nothing else to do. Like all of that, I don't have like a very specific tip of what to do, put your hand here, or regulate in this way, do that, other than just, if you can, as a mother in those moments, try to remember, okay, here we all are. Here we all are trying to do this. And I'm not alone with this. And I'm not going to be stuck here. And I'm going to figure it out. Don't have to figure it out right now.
I mean, goodness, all the feels. And I really am just thinking about how I talk so much about the perfect mother myth and the ways that we as humans, so many of us as girls, felt like we needed to be good and we felt like we needed to be this ideal version. And there was some way to do it right and to be perfect. And with our kids, there's some way to do it right and they'll be perfect. And we always fall short of that, blah, 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 blah. And how even in asking that question, I didn't even realize the way in which it's like this image of I should be perfect and every decision I should have made in my life and the people that I was surrounded by in making those decisions, because it's not just me, right? I don't exist in a bubble, but I should have done a better job curating who I was around so that everything to lead up to this moment would have been where I'm not in a situation where I'm dealing with grief and my kids aren't dealing with grief. And it's like,
yeah,
I can sit there and look at that and be like, but that's, I don't believe that, right? That's not how this works. And we all live in a complex world. We all are surrounded by the context we live in. we all exist in connection and in relation to others who are on their own journeys with grief and healing and being a human being. And there's nothing clean about that. There's nothing perfect about that. It's just a big mess that we're all in the most beautiful sense of the word. Like, it's just part of being human, and holding all of that and acknowledging that sometimes that means we're going to feel shame. Sometimes that means we're going to feel disappointment. Sometimes that means we're going to feel deep anger. Sometimes that means we're going to feel so hopeful and accepting of where we are and surrounded by gratitude and love. And it's all the things, and it can be all the things. And it's not even like shutting down those parts that say, how did I get to this situation? But knowing that that's also part of it. And it's okay to question that. It's okay
Yeah.
to that be part of it. It's very meta.
Yeah.
Grieving the grief.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, there's something when you were sharing that thought process we can have of like, if I had just, or like, when did I start messing it all up so that this is somehow my fault? That's a very young way of making sense of stuff when nobody helps you to see a different version of the story. And I just quickly want to share this moment that I had with somebody who's a really loving listening figure in my life. And I remember I was just sobbing to her about that last night in the hospital with my dad. I was with him overnight on his last night. And I was doing this thing of like, I finally figured, like, I just wish I had figured out what I figured out that night, the night before. And I would have said this to the nurse, and then I would have done that, and then I would have done this, and then he wouldn't have suffered. And there was a point where she just said, didn't know, didn't know. And I needed to hear that. And there's nothing about that you're like, wow, nobody's ever thought to say that to someone. But when you're in that moment of the guilt or the just, what could I have done for that to not have happened to somebody I love so much? Insert child, insert parent, insert whoever. And sometimes it really is something we did or said or right? But sometimes it's not, but we just so badly, that's a part of grief. It's a beautiful part of grief. It's so connected to our love and our really not wanting the world to be this way. When we look at what's going on in the world, when we have these images of what's happening in Gaza, you just, like what can I do? What should I have done? How am I, what, that's a part of it. It's not the only part of it, but it's really important to hold that and at the same time say, I didn't know, and sit with that, the grief of that. And there will be another time for sure. I think if we do this well for what do I know now, but that really simplified Maya Angelou, do what you can with what you know. And then when you do better, yeah, that's so true. But all the grief and the time that it takes to move through the what I didn't know and what I did or didn't do because of what I didn't know and what that stuff is a process that we really need to let play out because we do want to get to the, okay, what can I do? Now what am I going to do? Yeah.
And it's so continuous, and it just overlaps with new layers of life and what happens. And you're never at the end of it. You never know it all.
No. Yeah. We will always have that humbling experience of like, well.
Yep. Yeah. This conversation has like hit me just right in the heart, exactly what I needed to hear today, and heading into this time of year with this kind of new world that I'm living in. My own, personal context is completely different. So grateful that we got to have this conversation. And I think this is going to be powerful for other people who are out there listening and dealing with any amount of grief in any form. Before we wrap up the conversation, I really love asking moms who are on the podcast about self-care, because I think we have a lot of conversations about self-care in our culture, and, really understanding what it means to care for ourselves on a real level of like how I show up for myself in life is really important, because it can be kind of misconstrued of like, that's not that's not something I need to care about. So I would love to know how you show up for yourself, how you care for yourself on a regular basis, and just any words of advice for moms to make sure that they too are caring for themselves.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, speaking of things that we think we don't need, for me, there has been a total before and after, and I've witnessed so many befores and afters when it comes to having at least one good listener in your life who knows how to really just be with you as you need to be with your stuff, your great stuff, your hard stuff, any of it. Someone who really knows how to let it be yours and not make it theirs, but hold it with you and care so much about who you are, where you're at, and what matters to you. So I have several listening partners in my life. I actually have an appointment with my listening partner right after our call. I have spaces where we listen together. So that's what I host a lot in my community is, people know that they count on 2 times a month they come and we listen. And then I have one of those for me where I just show up and someone else is facilitating the space. So for me, it's like if you put all the self-care stuff that's within our control, because there's so much systemic stuff that's just I can't fix right away, it's up here. Like having good listeners in your life is way up here. All of the other stuff, like it's like, yeah, drink water. That's an easy one to bring in or do that. Yeah, yeah. But like this is such a game changer. So that's my big one that has really made this whole life thing, healing thing, parenting thing, such a rich and sustainable journey for me. One that I'm like, yeah, I've got this. Like I've got this for the long run, for the long haul.
I love asking that question because there's always something in there that's new and different. And I don't think I've asked this to every guest who's been on, and I don't think anyone has said a listener, right? There's like connection and different things like that. But having somebody to sit and listen and just hold that space is huge. I mean, that's something that like I am so passionate about. And I don't think I've ever heard that presented in that way as the most important piece of your self-care in such a big way. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been absolutely beautiful conversation. Where can listeners connect with you, learn more about your work, learn more about the spaces you hold, all of it?
Yeah, so one of the easiest things for people who use Instagram is my handle on Instagram is Healing Parents. And then if people want to read more about grief, they can go to my blog it's healingparents.co, and you just go to the blog and there's a little search bar where they can type in the word grief and a ton of things are going to come up because I write about it quite often. So if someone's looking for that, they will find that on my blog. But my website too is where you're going to learn all about the offerings. And if this idea of being listened to feels like maybe the missing piece of your puzzle, definitely get on my email list because that is where you find out regularly about ways to make that happen. So.
Love it. Thank you so much. And we'll have that all linked in the show notes. We're really easy to access. So definitely check out Gabriela's incredible resources and content.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing this moment with me and with everybody who is listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope that this, again, has given you something to take with you into the holiday season and beyond. You are worthy, Mama.